Let's try a different type of software here and see if we can get this to work. The video is giving me, of course, all kinds of issues. This week we're going to talk about investigation. I hope you had a great spring break. Your last assignment has been created and it should be available to you. If it's not now, it'll be available shortly. This week we also have our quiz. And exam 2. It'll cover from the last exam through investigation. So hopefully I can give you some tips here and you'll be in good shape. When it comes to the search and seizure stuff, like I said before, you gotta hopefully understand. I just love that stuff. So you're probably going to see some questions on there that are interesting, at least, and will be fact-based or scenario-based type questions, not just straight, questions that are, fill in the blank kind of stuff, or multiple choice. They'll have multiple choice answers, but they're well done. You'll also have an essay question that you'll need to be prepared for. So this week we talk about investigation, and investigation is a very small part of a police department. 10% or so. When we look at some of the things that investigators do, most in community policing, the areas or cities are broken down into areas, usually by geographic region. We talked about that in the chapter on units and divisions. And most agencies will try to have investigators assigned to a particular area. In the past, it was designed by crime. So an investigator that worked homicides would only work homicides or for the entire city. Now with community policing, an investigator works in a particular area, but he may catch all kinds of crimes. Now what's happened in this in reality is many agencies have found that this just doesn't work. And what they've had to do is go back to a specialist approach. Under community policing, generalist was the idea, and in the professional model, a specialist approach. Most agencies that I'm aware of have gone back to a specialist approach, just because you have so few people doing investigations, and so few people are assigned to detectives. So you'll have people that will do crimes against persons, and that would be sexual assaults, robberies, homicides, other assaults. Then you'll have crimes against property, burglaries and thefts. Then you'll have investigators assigned to white-collar crime, and then others assigned to computer crime, and then maybe a fraud division. And then in there you also have detectives that work narcotics, which is a bit of a misnomer. They work drug activity. And then you'll have at least one guy to intelligence, and that detective will maybe liaison with the FBI on counterterrorism stuff. You may have task forces that are filled with detectives, meaning they're groups from many agencies that get together, and they deal with certain issues. Back in the 90s, I worked in a task force that worked pretty much exclusively Colombian cartel people in financial investigations. So stuff like that. There's also JTTF, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and JTTF, an officer gets assigned, or two get assigned to it. It's run by FBI. The FBI people draw the really good leads. The investigators from other agencies get the follow-ups with the fertilizer store that sold 100 pounds of fertilizer to somebody. When we saw the bombing of the government building, in the 90s, that was a fertilizer bomb. The fertilizer packed into a U-Haul truck. So it was an effective device. Now, the first thing that we talk about in this week is going to be the idea of computer crime, social media kind of stuff. Really big. I can't believe there's people out there that are one, stupid enough to do an assault, and two, even dumber to put it on YouTube. Um, and but now we have detectives that work that. There's limitations to that. U.S. versus Anderson talks about those limitations and the amount of how evidence can be seized in those type of crimes. In Anderson was some guy who was trying to meet young girls, and the police posed as a young girl, and then he was eventually arrested. So as you look at the computer stuff, wide open area, wide open area. FBI has a brand new crime lab in Santa Ana, and it just works strictly on computer stuff. So very involved process. And then as we go through the week, we'll talk about that. We're going to review the history and the development of investigative function. As we were trying to move towards community policing, we needed to support that. Kansas City response time study, it was one of those areas, and what came from that was that the time frame from the discovery of the crime to the cops being called, to the cops arriving on scene. If you're any more than a couple minutes, 3 minutes away, you're not going to solve the crime. But there's a heavy reliance on patrol to gather the information that will lead at least to an arrest. Next thing we talk about are clearance rates. What clearance rates are is the ratio of arrests to, or I should say, ratio of crimes that are solved to the crimes that are reported. Understand there's a bunch of ways to clear a case. One would be an arrest. Two would be maybe the victim recants. A third way would be the suspect is arrested for another crime, maybe out of the jurisdiction, and is unreachable. You know who it is, you've identified him, you just can't prosecute. And then another way is the death of the suspect. In my career, I had several suspects that died before trial. Drunk driving accidents, being murdered by other people that weren't happy with whatever their activities were. And that happened a few times. As we talk about the clearance rate, understand that that's a benchmark that was a professional model benchmark that's carried over into the current view of investigation. The realities of investigation, it sounds really cool on TV. You got this really neat office, the good-looking partner, and then you have the that kind of sexual tension between them. And in reality, detective office is just a big open room with cubicles, and you work out of cubes, and the cubes have a computer and your desk and files, but much less glamorous. A highly sought after assignment because there's not a lot of direct supervision. With that, you have the supervisor that will assign cases and try to keep up on cases, will answer inquiries from the public, and there's many inquiries from the public. Why isn't my case being solved? What are you doing to work on it? How much time are you putting into it? A lot of those kind of questions. The next thing that we talk about are the different steps in the investigation. In preliminary investigation, super important. Can really throw an investigation behind. I wasn't involved in the case itself, but I know of a officer goes out on a missing persons call, and he doesn't really like the guy he's talking to. It just doesn't seem right. He takes a report, makes some observations. Victim's purse and her wallet and her car keys are still in the house. And guy says, she just walked away and I haven't seen her or talked to her. That case should have been spun up right then and there. The officer should have relied on his gut feeling, which was this wasn't right. So he didn't, and there was no follow-up done on the case until a few days later when it got to the detectives. Detectives read the case, and we got a lot of work to do here. Let's get moving on it. And then they went out, and here's my clock. And then they got moving on it and started to work the case. And eventually it turned out that the victim was in fact deceased. She'd been murdered by the husband and then taken down to a rural area in San Diego County where she was dumped. The body was dumped, and it was found several days later by some passerby. So preliminary investigation, super important. Um, you know, making sure for the officer, making sure that the scene's safe, making sure that there's room for everybody to work that's going to be working in the scene, not worrying about traffic, about friends, relatives of victims showing up wanting to see what's going on, to get involved, see the body, talk to witnesses, contaminate witnesses. Always a problem. And then you also have hostiles. You have people that are hostile towards a police function that come in and they have to be dealt with in a good way, of course, but they need to be dealt with. When you talk about a couple of tips here for exam time, Rand Corporation did a study of investigation and found out that most cases get less than a day of investigative work, which means a detective reads it, there's no workable information, and then they file the case. Maybe later a suspect is arrested in relationship to something else. They'll come back to that case and revisit it. We had a woman that was washing her dishes, looking out her window. It was dark at night, and some fool throws a brick through the window and hits her in the head and severely injures her. She survives. Well, that case went unreported unsolved for years. And investigators were interviewing a guy who was doing decent exposures. It seems like a really low-level crime, but those lead up to bigger things all the time. Well, this guy had been doing indecent exposures for a long time. He finally gets caught. The detective's interviewing him. The detective says, "Hey, is there anything else you want to talk about? Get off your chest." And he confesses to that other crime. So they pull the case out, and they're able to work it up, and then they file the case on him. The detective, has a substantial amount of cases that he gets depending upon the desk. The most often solved crime is homicide, is murder, and that's because we kill people we know. That changed slightly, or I should say significantly, not slightly, but significantly in the 80s and 90s with crack cocaine and violent drug gangs. Those become more difficult to solve, especially if somebody doesn't talk, doesn't brag about it. So look through the crime scene stuff. One thing you really need to know as we move on are the different types of crime scenes and Locar's exchange principle. A investigator or a scientist who said that every time anything comes into contact with something else, both things leave properties on the other. So how that works in policing is bad guy comes into a location, touches the counter, leaves fingerprints, leaves oil, maybe spit, and that will leave things that investigators can use. By the same token, the cops come in and they do an investigation. They too are going to leave things at the scene, and investigators have to be prepared to work, with that particular idea, understand that concept. Chain of evidence is something, if you're going into the business, you really need to be aware of chain of evidence, because what that does is that takes a piece of evidence that's discovered, moves it along goes from the officer that collects it. That goes to it gets booked into property. A property technician takes that and stores it. Once the property is stored, then it may be looked at by others later, and then you can can trace who's had contact with that. Very important in court. If you have a bad chain of evidence, then you'll probably lose the evidence in court. So we also talk about behavioral sciences and cultural clues and signature versus MO. A lot of the more behavioral science kind of stuff. Really good course that's offered in this major on behavioral science that you might want to consider taking if you don't have to take it in your track. So signature and modus operandi, the organized versus disorganized typology. It's important in some crimes that you really have a good understanding of this. Sexual assault is one that what a person says in a sexual assault, they often repeat, and you can use that to link things together, link crimes together, which can then be used in other techniques such as geographic profiling, which we'll talk about in a few weeks, but will give you the ability to limit your suspect pool. Really important area there. So once we get through that, we talk about how the investigator works. We come down to the Joint Terrorism Task Force and some concepts behind that. So, as I said before, this week you've got your exam. Hopefully this video is a little bit shorter. I don't have a timeline on this, the way that I'm recording this, but hopefully I can get it to you. And in any event, I'll see you all in class.